Okay, welcome back. We're going to get into our showmanship discussion this afternoon. Joining us today is John Pipkin. I won't add the doctor in there. I know it makes you cringe, but he has an excellent program at West Texas A&M and has developed more great judges than any one person single-handedly. Just has a great program. He's a great horseman, great judge, and a great friend. Him and his Kenda, they're celebrating their 31st wedding anniversary this week. They're always doing it the week of our judges workshops. So we really appreciate your time and your expertise. And John always brings so much value to everything that he does. There's so much knowledge in there. And we really appreciate you joining us in walking through some of our core classes that are really important. And you know, something about core classes, you know, you always want to try to see things with more clarity. And even though that you're going to see these classes, the halter, the showmanship, the horsemanship, western riding, and trail, almost every single weekend when you're out there judging, you've got to challenge yourself to be able to see it with clear eyes and to become a better judge every time that you go out. And every time that I learned stuff today with Tim, and you know, I've been in the horse industry my whole entire life and have bought horses with my own money, and you're always learning things, and that's important. When you stop learning, that you start going backward as an educator, as a judge, as a professional. Before we get started on the showmanship, we had a question talking about lameness. So John, I was hoping you would walk through that lameness part. I also want to let you know that John is also on our judges committee with Tim Finkenbinder. So we've got some really strong representation from our judges committee. And you know, I've had you know, the judges committee is a representation of the judges. It's so I think that some people don't really know that the judges committee, their purpose is to represent our pool of judges. So know that they're there as a resource always.
Patty, thank you so much for having me here. Those are really probably overly gracious comments, but I really appreciate that, and it's just an honor and a pleasure to be a part of this. And as you were speaking to the educational process, I've heard it said that, you know, if you're ever ripe, you're rotten, you know, and so I don't want to ever get ripe. I want to keep growing and keep developing myself as a judge, and being a part of this definitely does that. But hearing other clinicians, like what the information covered this week by the various experts, has just been really, really eye-opening and continually refreshing and growing. So, and I'm sure, you know, in reading a lot of the comments on the chats, I've seen similar kind of comments. So thanks to you and your team and all of AQHA and the Judges Committee for putting all this together. And you know, I will make a little plug also, not only for the Judges Committee, but also for professional horsemen.
Yes.
Because you really come from the professional horseman ranks and still today represent that group so well. And I know that many of our judges are members, and I would encourage every judge to become a member of the professional horseman ranks because of the perspective that they bring to the table and the group that they represent. So.
Absolutely. And Karen McQuestion is our Director of Professional Horsemen, and if you have any questions on becoming a professional horseman, please email her, reach out to her. And, you know, I believe that every judge should be a pro horseman. Any knowledge that you can get, the professional horsemen have an excellent outreach program, excellent educational program, excellent crisis fund program, and we believe that all judges should be in our professional horseman program.
Yeah. Okay. To your question about lameness that I think actually came from the previous session, but we pick up with that because that obviously pertains to the classes that we're about to address, plus all the other classes this week. And I think there's probably been a comment about lameness in most of the different sessions.
Right.
But we always go back to our trustee rule book, and
Absolutely.
gosh, it's our best friend, and the closer that we can follow our guidelines in here, probably the safer we're all going to be, and that's always a great resource to be able to go to.
Exactly.
And so I try real hard to go to that. And there's a couple of things in here, you know, relative to lameness in the first place. Really, it's all about first and foremost ensuring the welfare to our animals. And that's really why this is in here in the first place, is to give us some guidance on making sure that we're not continually working horses that shouldn't be worked. And yet there is definitely a line, and maybe sometimes a gray line, as to if a horse is lame or if it's just a movement issue on that particular day. As I get older, sometimes when I, get out of bed first thing in the morning, they disqualify me, as I hobble around the house. So it takes a little time sometimes to get warmed up and going. And so I think at times maybe if a horse has been standing still and as they go off initially, there's a line there between just a little bit of a kind of get things warmed up versus that it's a welfare consideration in lameness.
Right.
And so as judges, I know that we're always trying to keep that in mind, and that we always want to try to give the exhibitor the benefit of the doubt. But there's some pretty good clear guidelines in here that I think if there's some key words that would help guide us. One is that it's obvious. And that we need to not be hunting buggers and trying to imagine something that isn't there, and to be pretty clear about it. I love how Tim spoke earlier about letting things get your attention. Right. Now, part of that is that we have to be paying attention and have to be recognizing it if we see it. But at the same time, we don't need to be hunting it so much that we imagine something that may not clearly be there.
Right.
And that you can always, if you're not quite sure if it's to the point that you should stop the horse or that you should disqualify them and or remove them from the class, you can always consider it a movement consideration as a part of every single class. And even from the classes that we're going to go to here, that comes into play there. So I think that's one of the considerations. And then there's some other guidelines in the rules here where it talks about that it is consistently observable.
Right.
And I think that's a key phrase that can help guide us. If it's one of those things that gosh, about every 10th or 15th step, they look a little off here. That's different than every single stride you see either some marked nodding of the horse's head or some hitching of the hind leg or of the hip, and that it's really consistently noticeable. And that would obviously be beyond a real clear evidence that if a horse literally can't stand on it and bear weight, then that's very, very obvious.
Right, and I think you got to pay attention to the horse's footfalls. I think a lot of rear end lamenesses get overlooked, and you've got to look at how that horse is tracking up. Right. Exactly. Pay attention. It's much more obvious if they're head bobbing at the trot. But you've got to really, you've got to also assess the lameness behind.
Right.
And it's an animal welfare issue.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And that needs to be foremost of our concern.
Right. And, I think if it's, like John said, if it's not obvious, then the benefit of the doubt always goes to the exhibitor. In any penalty application, any obvious, disqualifying somebody or applying a major penalty is a big duty, and you want to make sure that it's obvious. And if it's not obvious, then take it out of, it's not a good mover. If it's not obvious, then it's not a good mover.
Right.
And address it, that way, address it in your maneuver score. If it's obvious, address it, be confident in your decision, but make sure it's obvious.
Right, very good. So you think that addresses that fair enough?
I think what do you think, Karen? That'll address it?
That's excellent.
Okay,
yes.
good. Perfect. Let's move on to showmanship.
Very good. How exciting.
Absolutely.
What a fun class. How many of us can probably raise our hand that this might have been the first class that we ever showed in
Absolutely.
as we got started in the horse showing business.
Yep.
And that, it's such a great entry point for so many of our exhibitors, both youth and amateur.
Right.
And I think even a lot of our professional ranks today probably started back in there. So it's a really important class for our judges to fully understand and make sure that we're going about it in the right fashion, and that we're trying to get the right horses as the prop, as well as those exhibitors, and that we're making sure that we're emphasizing the right things, rewarding that excellence, and then as we recognize faults, that we take that into consideration properly too.
Well, exactly. And, if you cannot control a horse on the ground, you're not going to be able to control them on their back.
That's right.
And that's really important. And showmanship is a class that was developed to teach people, exhibitors, people how to show their horse at halter and how to properly set up their horse and know where their horse is and be aware of where their horse's legs are and keep them in control. And showmanship's like dancing. That horse and that exhibitor, they're partners.
That's right.
Yeah, at a high level, that's what you're aiming for. Is when you're coaching, or if you do showmanship, you're wanting to become a partner with your horse in any event that you do.
And they should dance well together.
Exactly. That's right. Exactly.
That's right. And even from a real practical standpoint, people that say, "Oh, I'm not interested maybe in showing in the class." Well, anybody that goes to present a horse for sale, or just to show it off to one of their friends or family or something like that,
Right.
you want to be able to bring out a horse and be able to present them properly and not have them waller all over them and step on them or not be led properly, those kinds of things. So
Exactly.
this all hopefully has real practical application, in how a horse person will manage their horse from the ground.
That's right. And with what our guidelines are going to be, our structure that John and I are going to teach today, we're going to do an opening of each class, and then we're going to have you go and judge right off the bat. We know you want to practice judging, so we hope that you have your score sheet laid out, and we'll talk about our score sheet and our showmanship pattern. And we don't have a practice horse either, because this is real live judging. So you go to a horse show, and you're not going to get a pattern horse before you actually go and judge. So we want you to be prepared on your pattern. We sent you an email earlier saying, hey, print off your patterns, print off your score sheets. One of the questions that John and I wanted to address is what happens if your pattern that you have has more than our pattern class score sheet right now has, I think, 7 spots. And I turned it into 9, so you can see that this pattern that we have, we've broken it down into 9 maneuvers. We actually separated the setup and the inspection. And for us, the setup is one of the most important components of showmanship. And when I'm drawing my patterns for the world shows, to me, setups are important. It's a foundation of the class. So in my finals patterns, I usually have more than one setup because that to me is important, and I want people to, and I've seen that progression this year from the youth world, the level 1 championships, to the open world shows. People are setting their horses up better, and so I think that setup needs a lot of emphasis. So we separated in this pattern the setup and the inspection. Now, this is important when you're getting to a horse show and you get together, and some of this will be overlap that we'll talk about showmanship and horsemanship, is that, and trail, you need to make sure that your score sheet, all your score sheets are set up with the correct maneuvers. And it's an opportunity as judges to get together and get on the same page. What are the hot spots of the pattern? Where do you think that there's going to be issues? It's always good to be prepared. You want to be prepared for the very first horse that comes in. You don't get a pattern horse at the horse show, and you don't want those first exhibitors to sacrifice. There's already people don't want to go at the beginning because they feel they're not going to be fairly judged. Well, it's our job to be prepared for that very first horse that comes in, and you're going to do that. Part of that preparation is getting together with the judges and discussing the pattern and making sure that your score sheet, all your score sheets are filled out exactly the same. You have the same maneuvers. So this pattern, we have walk as a maneuver 1, trot as maneuver 2, stop and back, maneuver 3, a turn and 3/8 your turn. We've got a trot, and then we have the walk to the judge. We're going to assess the setup, the inspection, and the quarter turn, and then the exit at a walk or trot. Now, we encourage you to, we like to see people, draw their own patterns. When you do that, make sure you know what your arena is like. Make sure you know that what kind of exhibitors that you're going to be judging that day. Get a show bill, ask the show management, hey, is this high level? We've all made that mistake where you've used a pattern that's been too easy and it's hard to separate all the exhibitors, or if your pattern is too hard, you're going to be discouraging people. And again, this is an entry-level class, and we bring a lot of our new members in the showmanship and in the horsemanship, and so it's very important that your pattern suits the level of competition that you're judging. And also, a very good tip is that if you've got several different classes, John, you judged a show in South Carolina, and you had how many different showmanship classes?
A lot. 20.
20 showmanship classes, and they so it's important that your cone configuration, where you have your cones, you can take that same pattern and make it more difficult or less difficult for the different levels of competition that you have. And so you set your cones one time for showmanship and horsemanship, and you're good to go. It'll make your day it'll help the show run more smooth as being a team member of getting that show done efficiently. And what else do I need to add to that?
Well, the only thing I would really add is that if you happen to be the judge that didn't supply the pattern, I think it's especially mindful that you consult who it is that did and go, okay, help me know where's the places I really need to be looking for certain things. You mentioned the hot spots.
Right.
And so, this is really your pattern because you designed this. Mm-hmm. Gosh, Patty, help me make sure that I'm aware of where do you think the trouble spots might be and that kind of thing before the first horse goes.
Right.
Because, I know that I've at times not had the benefit of that insight and not figure it out, but it's not necessarily the first or the first few horses. Right. And so the more insight I think you can get from whichever judge might have designed and provided that pattern, I think that's helpful.
Right, and it's part of being a responsible judge is to, be prepared.
Right.
And we have to wear so many hats, but we ultimately are driving the industry either in a positive or negative direction and bringing either developing growth in our industry or not. So.
Right. The only other two little things is sometimes I'll get the question, how many different maneuvers do I need to have? Is there a required number for the score sheet?
Not at this point. We've discussed it on that. We've got a task force that's working on the patterns, and we've talked about that. But you want to make sure that you've got enough that you can fairly assess them. I think that when you're drawing patterns, it's important to, I always start when I draw, my guideline is to know what arena I'm going to be judging in. And I list 2 or 3 maneuvers that are very important to me. Obviously, setup is always on my list when doing a showmanship pattern. And then, you don't want it to be a whole bunch of transitions. You got to have your maneuvers spread out long enough to assess their ability as a horseman and their connection to their horse.
Agreed.
Good.
Yeah, I just try to make sure that I've walked,
yes,
jog or
there
trotted,
you go. Yep,
set up,
yes,
and then, with an inspection,
right,
and change of direction somehow, whether it's a steering line or whether it's a small turn or a large turn, whatever, that somehow those components are in there.
Very good.
And as you look at that current score sheet, the other thing that I want to make sure people understand is that they're not required to have 7 maneuvers. If they happen to have a pattern that maybe has fewer than that, that's okay. And if they want to break it up into more pieces, then they're obviously, as this example shows, they can do that.
And if your level of competition, if you're judging a rookie or a level 1 showmanship class, you might have a pattern that's more simplified. So you're going to have maybe 4 or 5 maneuvers.
The only other comment I'd make in terms of getting ready to judge the first horse like we're about to do is if you have a scribe or if you don't, make certain that if you do have a scribe that you explain to them how it is you're going to call things, what it is that you would want recorded, checks, check pluses, minus, whatever that may be, or in the other classes, obviously a number. And then if you're self-scribing, you need to make sure that you have a plan as to when's an appropriate time for you to glance down and make some kind of a little mark that you don't miss anything important. And
Right.
I think that in most patterns, a judge can find those if they're self-scribing, but you need to have a pretty good plan in advance or you can miss something really important.
Do we have a question?
In with that conversation
Okay.
though, in this particular pattern, would it be okay to combine that walk and trot? There's a transition in there.
Absolutely.
And then if it's a multi-judge situation, would you want all your judges to have the same maneuvers?
Great question. Absolutely. That's very important in a multi-judge situation, that all your maneuvers are the same. And going back to yesterday in the versatility ranch horse, it's very important that all your tiebreakers are the same as a group of judges getting together and making sure you're concurrent on your maneuvers in all your classes and concurrent on your tiebreakers.
Yeah. And I think that's really good. And I think that one of the reasons why some judges will go ahead and combine maneuvers is that they don't want to look down at, and I respect that.
Sure.
I've kind of trained myself to where I can self-scribe and I can hold my pad such that at least at the minimal out of my periphery, I never take my eye off the horse and
Right.
exhibitor, because
Right.
you don't want to look
Can't
down and study and
miss
completely lose sight of the horse. And one of the things I know that I've heard some exhibitors say is that if there's too many things lumped together and they either have a plus or a minus in there, they're not maybe quite sure what component it is that is being either rewarded or penalized.
Good point.
And so that is one of the upsides perhaps of breaking it into more. But again, you don't want to have it so that you're looking down at the paper too much and that you're missing important things.
That's very good.
Okay, ready? Do some
Very-
judging?
Very good. We got 5 horses for you to judge.
Goes nice and quick.
3. There's 3 horses to judge. Thank you, Tanner. 3 horses to judge, and then we'll continue on. So be ready for the first horse, and away we go.
Well, that was fun.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is go through and talk about the class now, and then we'll go back and score those runs that you just scored. So we hope you're ready for the first horse, and again, that's going to be our format for the day. Is we'll do a little introduction on the classes, go score some, talk about the class, and then go back and rejudge those classes.
This is to train our judges to be patient, because now they have to wait, because they want to know what the answer
That's
is right now.
That's right, anticipation.
They want to know what the answer is.
Exactly,
Patience,
exactly.
right?
So showmanship, again, like we've talked about, was developed to teach people how to have control of their animal on the ground and how to properly show their horse at halter. And so it's designed to evaluate the exhibitor's ability to execute in concert with their horse. Their horse is a partner, it's their dance partner. That the horse is well groomed and conditioned. That's definitely a consideration that we'll talk about as we go along for sure. And those maneuvers will help you evaluate how well in concert they are with their horse. And they need to do it with precision and smoothness while exhibiting poise, confidence, and maintaining a balanced, functional, and fundamentally correct body position. And so in any of our events, something that we do not want to do is reward excessive. Remember that as judges, we are driving the industry forward, and as if we are rewarding a trend that is excessive, that is going to start, people think that that's what's winning, and then the next thing you know, we've got a really bad trend out there. And I will say that, we've had some trends in the past, and I think that, being out in the field, that a lot of the stiffness is gone, and a lot of anything in extreme is really, we're getting some beautiful horsemen and horsewomen that can show their horse, doing it very, very well.
Yes, I think that sometimes our placings, intentionally or unintentionally, sometimes send a message that the exhibitors pick up. And hopefully the score sheet's going to help with that too.
Right.
In them being able to look across and, gosh, your first place winner may only have a score of 70, and there may be some things in that score sheet there that would reflect back to them where they were rewarded and then where they were deducted. So that they, just because they were first in that particular class, doesn't mean there weren't some things that we wouldn't want to improve.
Exactly. Very well said. Okay, so keys for becoming an effective judge or improving your effectiveness as a showmanship judge. You got to know, follow, and apply the rules and standards. And they've talked, that's a common thread on all the clinicians throughout the week. Read your rule book on the way to the horse show. You're always going to find something new in the rule book. Don't ever assume that you know what the rules are, because our rule books are already worn out, and they're 2000. It's not even 2018, and we've already got them wore out.
Right.
So yeah.
And you never can really fully know the rules beyond just the tip of your tongue. I think that it's always important. Anytime I'm on an airplane or anything like that, going to the next show, I always pull it out and make sure that I reread the rules and refresh myself. And even if I feel like I know them forwards and backwards, I always want to refresh myself on those classes that I'm going to be judging, so that I'm there, ready, have them, forefront in my mind to be able to go forward. And because any class, if we know the rules and if we're clear on the standards and not making our own up, and then we have a methodology that you're about to address, you can judge anything as long as you're clear with those items.
That's right. And, we talked about using appropriate patterns. Be careful of using any online patterns. Make sure that you proof them. Make sure that they follow the guidelines in the rule book that they're for your breed. And make sure that the cone placement is appropriate for all the different classes that you're going to have to do, so you're not having to get up and move the cone placement in between every single class.
Right.
Anything you want to add?
It's all good.
We're good? Yes.
Yes. Very often the ring stewards prepare the score sheets ahead of time without asking the judges what maneuvers. How do you want us to handle this?
Okay, so unfortunately that happens, and I think we talked about this in the ring stewarding. That was one of the tips they gave to the ring stewards, is do not fill out the maneuvers ahead of time, because it might not be the way that the maneuvers the judges want. So if that happens, you have to be comfortable of how you're going to, how that pattern is going to break down. And you can thank your ring steward for being so efficient, but you want to, change some of the maneuvers, and you can fill out one score sheet and then have it photocopied at the show. So as a ring steward tip is, you can help get when the judges are together, fill out a score sheet and you can photocopy it. It's a great comment, because that does happen, but you've got to be, you're ultimately responsible, and so you might have to undo what's been done.
Great effort. Sometimes just need to be a little more patient and wait for the judge's affirmation.
That's right, and that's one of the things. So those of you that are out there that want a ring steward, go watch our ring steward webinar, because it was excellent.
Great.
Okay.
Also a question, is there a bullseye area you'd suggest focusing on in the showmanship as you're judging, or is it more of the wording here is a busy eye type of class?
Well, I think we'll probably address that a little more specifically coming, but I would say that you need to be aware of many different things, and so that's going to be important that you learn to know yourself on what you need to do with your eyes, because depending upon where you're at in the pattern is going to be potentially where your eyes are going to need to be relative to that particular maneuver. So that's going to vary from part to part within the pattern, and yet at the same time you still need to have a broad enough perspective to where you can see the entire picture, and yet there's going to be some key focus places where you need to make sure that you're extremely aware, and perhaps that's where your main focus is. So hopefully we'll come back and we'll address that a little more specifically, but maybe that touches on it there.
We've got just one more quick one. When sending in patterns, would it be okay for the judges to also send in a copy of the corresponding score sheet with the maneuvers filled out?
We love that, and I want to speak on that side as from being on the show management side of AQHA and managing the show side of it, and also from the judges side. I get, as a courtesy to the show management, when somebody calls you to judge a horse show or emails you, please respond to them promptly. Even if you don't know, I need to check my calendar, let me get back to you in a couple days or a day, or is it okay if I get back to you tomorrow, and then follow through. It is so important that you're courteous. Being a good judge is just not about placing a good scorecard. It's about getting along with show management, being courteous, being a good servant to the horse show. You're going to have lots of you're going to build a great reputation as a judge, as being a good judge. It's just not about scoring horses, and that's one of the things. Be courteous to the show management, and they love that, because they're having to track the judges down, and we respect that everybody's busy, but that's part of your responsibility as a judge, is to get those patterns that you're requested in a timely manner. And above and beyond, kudos to the judges if you send a copy of that score sheet with the maneuvers broken down. That just is just an absolute bonus.
Yep.
So whoever wrote that in, they get the gold star.
Yep. Great reminder. Service industry, we're there to provide a service, and we need to remind ourselves that people have given their hard-earned dollar.
Absolutely.
And that we need to make sure that we're respectful of that and appreciative of it, and come across with a grateful spirit about that.
That's right. It's not about us as a judge. It's about the industry and giving back to the industry.
Right.
Very good. Thank you, Karen. Great questions. We appreciate those. Pattern has to be posted an hour ahead of time. That's kind of almost a dinosaur guideline, because they're posted online, and we post our patterns for the Level 1 championships a month ahead of time. We do not release our World Show patterns until the first day of the horse show, but they need to be posted an hour ahead of time. Make sure that, like we talked about, using the maneuvers allowed and required. Work individually from the gate, or all enter at the same time and work individually. I prefer, to be fair to all the exhibitors, to have them work from the gate. You can do both. It's in our rules that you can do both.
You generally just work with show management on that? Is that your guidance there?
Yeah, if they've got, yes, absolutely. Good.
Yep.
talked about designing appropriate tests.
I think the key word on that is really appropriate, because
Right.
we probably have all unintentionally at times seen situations where we've either had a pattern that was too difficult,
Right.
and so it was just created a mess,
Right.
or that it wasn't challenging enough, and so we didn't have enough of a test to separate the level of exhibitors there. And so knowing as best you can is about all that you can do. And so sometimes if you can get some feedback appropriate from show management, then, or if you have some kind of insight about the size of the show or the level of the exhibitor, I think that can really help guide those patterns in their difficulty.
Absolutely. You want those patterns to be very encouraging for your rookie and level ones, and challenging and the different age groups. You know, one thing I've learned, if you've got a select, if you're setting a pattern for selects, don't have them trot very much, because some of them can't. They're not physically capable of doing it. And you know, the 14 to 18 and amateur people, they want to be challenged. They can trot more, but the selects and the younger kids may be more difficult. So keep that into consideration.
Yes, and at the same time, then if you make it too easy, you can insult people too.
Exactly. There is a definite balance in that. We don't want to insult our select exhibitors, but we want to encourage them for sure.
Right.
Very good. So I think, you know, in the rule book, you've got it lists the maneuvers that are acceptable. I think something that is worth talking about here is, well, first of all, multiple turns. I think you've got to be cognizant when you're drawing your patterns and using your patterns. If you have a pattern with maybe 2 turns in it, I mean, that puts a lot of stress on horses' hocks. I try not to when I'm doing designing patterns, not to do anything more than a turn and a half, because that does put a lot of stress when we're training our horses. The pull turn is unacceptable, and the mandatory thing, the judge must have exhibitors set the horse up squarely for inspection sometime during the class.
I think that's all great. The only other little subtle comment I might make is if it's, that there's probably good, you know, we show here in parentheses fractions that at times I think beyond just the degrees, in case people don't have their protractor and compass out, you know, to know exactly what that amount is. And so I think it's probably good to put both of those numbers down.
Right.
And to make sure that they're the same correctly.
Well, that's well said, that you make sure that your patterns, the verbiage matches the drawing.
That's exactly right.
That is,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
good. That's really good. Hey, you want to talk about?
Oh, yeah, sure. So scoring, that comes back to the methodology that you're going to use. And we have a pretty prescribed system set out for us here that we'll go and we'll look at when we're going through and scoring those runs that we had. But remember that we're operating within a range of 0 to 100. And ultimately, yes, we want to get our class place, but we want, hopefully, to our scores to reflect the level of performance.
Right.
And that it has rewarded excellence. And I think we need to be as rewarding as we possibly can be, because we have a lot of range to work within, and then to deduct appropriately, but without necessarily being overly discouraging. You know, we don't want to discourage our exhibitors. We'd like for them to hopefully have a positive experience and come back,
Right.
but that they recognize maybe where they need to improve and where they were faulted.
Right.
So we want to provide a balance of that so that ultimately our scores will be such that they can provide a placing, because at the end of the class, that's what it is we have to do, is we have to place. And if we end up just literally having all of our exhibitors, let's say, scored 70, and maybe their performances really didn't reflect that, if we would have used the full range of what we can score, then that's really not doing the best job that we can for our exhibitors. We want to try to make sure that, again, we try to use a reasonable amount of range.
So OF&P is really important.
It is,
Overall
yeah.
presentation, overall form and presentation of the exhibitor.
It is very important,
Yeah.
and that's a column there, and we'll make comment of it now, but when we look at the score sheet, we'll see that there's some letters that are recommended to reflect the overall presentation and the appearance and performance of that horse and exhibitor. And the question comes up often about, you know, when do you apply that? Well, I can't effectively apply that when I look up and I see the horse and exhibitor. I haven't seen enough of that run yet. So I'll wait until either significantly into that run or at a place where I feel comfortable that I can make a mark on that, or even I know some judges that'll wait till the very end of the run to make the mark. They've been developing that score as the run proceeded, from wherever they might have had a first impression to wherever they ended up.
So it's kind of like a thermometer.
It is.
You know, your range kind of moves up and down as that person goes on, and yeah.
It sounds like Bill Ink right there. That was good.
Thermometer. It is. It's like judging the hunters. Our hunter specialty judges that come over and do our equitation, they have no problems with this scoring system because their mind already goes that way as they're moving up and down and assessing their hunter scores.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And we're going to take into account both the presentation and appearance of this horse and exhibitor, as well as the pattern performance itself. And so there's a lot to consider, and it takes expertise in being able to do that. And I know that's what our judges, have developed and will continue to do so. The rule book breaks down in various pieces, and so what we're covering here on this PowerPoint is straight out of the rule book, and I encourage everybody to always reread that. Again, refresh yourself about what are maybe some key components out of that. And the other part is if you have contact with exhibitors, I think it's always great to remind our exhibitors that they need to educate themselves as well. I find lots of times that it seems to me that our exhibitors are undereducated, and that they need to do a little bit better job at times of understanding the rules as they literally are in the rule book, and that could help guide them and have a visual and a mental picture about how they need to be performing and things they need to be considering. So for instance, this is just a real overall kind of a picture of what you want to have represented there, and maybe some of those terms are a little bit vague, but we get into more specifics here in just a second. But I think everybody realizes when we talk about physical appearance here, we're not talking about conformation like what you and Tim talked about.
Right.
We're talking about other aspects of appearance and grooming and preparation.
Absolutely. And an exhibitor that has self-carriage and that carries themselves, and everybody has their own style, and you're not trying to put everybody into a cookie mold. It depends on their body shape and how they carry themselves, but that they're working in unison with their horse.
Absolutely. As we move into the rest of this discussion here, I know that there are some amazing outfits, and there's a humongous clothing industry around the horse industry, and that's excellent. But at the end of the day, we need to remind ourselves as judges that the wording right here is what's really important for us, is that it needs to be appropriate Western attire, which includes their hat.
Yep.
And that neat and clean, and you could probably insert in here somewhere the thought of professional. It needs to look professional.
Right, exactly. And there's not a judge out there, and those of you, you're judging, or you're already out there judging, and you notice how something fits, and if it's appropriate,
right,
before you ever notice, wow, that looks like an expensive outfit. You should be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I wish more exhibitors would know that.
Yes. All right. In terms of other general things, again, this is a good overall type of description, and I think those really come back to our whole point of we want to recognize and reward where we can, and then also where there's faults. We want to take that in consideration. Okay. I think here what we're really wanting to make sure that we emphasize again is that we want this professional, business-like type of manner, and that we want it to look natural versus, and I think Patty mentioned earlier that it was almost comical sometimes, some of the unnatural things that exhibitors were doing.
Exactly.
That they certainly weren't staying upright, and it certainly at times was excessive and didn't appear natural, and they were definitely some animated things. And I think our exhibitors have done a good job of moving away from that, so I'm going to pat our professional horsemen on the back and tell
our
them,
judges, because they've been out there rewarding the right things.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so somehow I think that message has gotten to our exhibitors, and we want to maintain that we want it to be that way.
That's right.
Again, I think going back to our exhibitor being educated here, at times you'll see trends that might kind of creep into the various classes, is that if they'll just read through these descriptions of how they're supposed to lead, how they're supposed to set up, how they're supposed to turn and present their horses, all those aspects, it's really quite clear in all that description. So unless we have questions that Karen gets, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this, and we'll just leave it to our judges to know this and realize they need to make sure that they've stayed educated on it. There's some pretty clear direction of the range of acceptability of where this exhibitor should be. And again, you're wanting them to look professional. You're wanting them to minimize the amount of motion. You don't want them to be a distraction.
Right.
That ultimately this is about learning how to present horses, and it's about presenting the horse, not necessarily the person.
We have some questions.
All right.
Get a chance to get caught up.
We've got a question, a general question about the patterns.
Yes.
If it turns out there's a discrepancy between the drawing and the written pattern, would the written portion take precedence or be the final say? How would you handle that?
Do you want me to address that?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're looking at one another.
I'm going to see if we're on the same page.
Okay, I'll take a stab, and then you can correct me, boss.
We have a 50-50 chance.
Yeah, you can correct me, boss.
I know.
First of all, I would say that I would try to make sure it's clearly announced, and I would try to make sure that we work with the announcer and that is everybody we can possibly get notified, including the gate person if we have a gate person or someone that's in the alley that can let exhibitors know as much as possible, because we're not there to get you, or to sneak up or trick people. We want to try to make sure that's clear. And I do know that sometimes that definitely happens. So I would say that first of all, we want to try to provide as much clarification on the showgrounds and to disseminate that message as much as we possibly can. Then at that point, hopefully you've gotten that discrepancy cleared up, that whether it's you're going to go with changing the written so that it matches the drawn because that's what you really wanted, or vice versa, that you've provided that clarification whichever way it is, so that now they're synchronized, they're back in place with one another, and that hopefully we've notified all of our exhibitors.
Is that good?
That's awesome.
I love that answer.
Everything else to add on that?
No, I think that's great.
All right, good.
Phew.
Okay.
That's great. Is there any other questions?
No, that catches us back
Okay,
up.
good.
Aaron, stop making up those questions. It's good. No, I'm just teasing you. That's good. That's really good.
Well, and this is a thing that is always good for discussion, is the position of the exhibitor when backing. And, we give them, when we talk about, it's a, big penalty if they're in front of their horse, so you better make sure that they're in front of their horse if you're going to call that. And different people have different, some people have shorter arms. Some people have longer arms. The longer arms people are going to be able to get in that position and maintain it easier. Shorter person maybe with shorter arms. But what we do, the ideal position is for the exhibitor's left shoulder to be in line with the horse's left front leg and not in front of the horse. That's our guideline we use. And it's very important that when you go to judge any pattern class that you're sitting in a position that you can see the pattern correctly, because once you sit there, you're committed. The first horse goes, you're committed to staying there. So that's important, that if there's a backup, that you're sitting somewhere that you can assess that backup, and you can look at where their feet are. I think it's sometimes if you're backing a corner, backing a curve, you can get in front of your horse a little easier. Right. I mean, you got to really have a clear mental guideline of visual of where that is.
Yeah. A really good comment there, and that raises a couple of thoughts. First of all, about the backing, is that I'm sure that all of our judges are realizing that this is about safety, first of all. That's why that's in there in the first place, and why it can become a severe if you're absolutely certain that they're clearly in front of this horse and have positioned themselves in a dangerous spot. Then you're going to see some other situations where maybe exhibitors are trying to use it to help get their horse to back up. And so maybe they've trickled over to where they're maybe just a little bit further in front of that horse than they should be, but maybe not completely in front. Or I've even seen exhibitors where they'll hold their hand out literally in front of the horse's head.
Yes.
And so as they move towards the horse is trained to move back. And I definitely want to take that into consideration if they've used that excessive positioning of their part of their body. I didn't consider that at the time that they were literally standing in front of this horse, but I took that into consideration in that maneuver.
Right. And that's one thing I have seen a little bit as out there every once in a while. it pops up as you get the exhibitor that gets into that backing position, and they actually move that hand on the other side of the horse's body
Right.
as almost an aid to keep them straight. And so that is definitely a fault, not a penalty. We're not going to call that being in front of the horse, but definitely a minus, maybe a double minus on the maneuver.
Agreed. The other comment that you made about where you are as a judge, that's challenging it sometimes in these patterns, because you take, for instance, the pattern that we used today is that there's a lot of different angles and a lot of different directions that horse and exhibitor are going, and you're limited in how much you can move as a judge.
Right.
And just like what you said, wherever you start with that first exhibitor in that class, that's where you need to try to stay. Now, I know there may be some situations where a judge may be able to take a step or two from a position to another within a class, but they need to make sure they've done that consistently on every single horse.
Right.
And
if you're sitting in a chair, you can't do that.
absolutely, yeah. If you're standing, which I try to stand most of the time.
I do too. I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it's not, practical if you've got a very big class.
Right.
But I think you should stand whenever
I
you
agree.
can.
I think our exhibitors get a impression that you're a little more in tune, that you're a little more attentive and such. And I realize that some situations that may not be best, but
Right.
when possible. Then if I would say this too, is that if you go with this first class and you recognize that your position was not a good one, then before the next class, I think it's okay for you to
Absolutely.
change to a position that you think is going to give you a better perspective of certain things.
Right.
'Cause I've certainly learned that the hard way.
Yeah, and sometimes as a judge, if you're working with a ring steward that has a tablet, you have no choice but to sit, because they can't stand and balance clipboard and a tablet if you're lucky enough to have a ring steward at your show. But if you don't have a ring steward at the show, and the showmanship classes aren't huge, we encourage you to stand up. I think it shows you that you're have respect for the class, and you're just a little added
And
bonus.
I'm one of those kind of weird ones that I like the exercise, and
Yes.
so I actually like to do the inspection on the horses.
Very good.
So I know not all judges like to do that, but
Right?
yeah, it's good.
Exactly. Good.
The only comment I would really make on this slide is just make sure that you're clear about what the quarter method is.
Right.
There was a point in time in our rule book that was actually an option. That's been a number of years ago.
You're dating yourself.
Oh, sorry about that. But the whole point of all that, and really what that quarter method is that it should position the exhibitor to where they're in a safe position at all times,
Right.
as well as where the judge's position is, that they're hopefully in a safe position, that the exhibitor could control their horse better,
Right.
that if the horse were to do something, and it also positions that exhibitor where they can see the judge.
Right.
So, rather than being, I think, so overly conscious about, here's this line and here's that line, that maybe they have to move it at this exact specific point in time, that to me it's a little more important that mainly you recognize that they're where they need to be for their safety, you, the judge's safety, and that they
Right.
can see you all those times. I'm not saying that, I'm not in any way meaning to compromise what that quarter method is, but that's really the key components of what that quarter method, I think, represents.
Goes back to common sense. Right.
Which is not always common.
That's right.
All right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered that.
I think so.
Yeah.
We
We've
good?
covered that.
Yep.
Yep. Let's talk about appearance of the horse.
Yes. Again, from a welfare standpoint, we as judges need to make sure that we're aware that really, in this class as well, specifically, because a lot of the preparation for this class happens before they ever walk in as an exhibitor. This horse having been conditioned properly, and when we talk about that, we literally mean body condition. When we talk about good body condition, and if you're familiar with a body condition score of 0 to 9, where 4 is about moderate, I would say that most of our show horses are going to be somewhere from 4 to 6, maybe some will creep into the 7. But when we get below that 4, that means that a horse is going to really start looking pretty thin, and that we would maybe not to the emaciated stage, because there's that description in our rules. It talks about the dull, lethargic, emaciated. So we're probably talking below a 3 at that point.
Right.
But once we start creeping into that 3 number, And that would be of some concern, and that's a consideration for you to make. And then, obviously, it may depend a little bit upon the time of the year, but that hair coat is, and the cleanliness, as well as that they're brushed, and looks like there's been effort to try to get that horse prepared before that class ever started, is going to be a part of what you're evaluating here in this exhibitor's preparation.
Well, and I think too, and then also know what country you're judging in, because
Absolutely.
some of the countries that you can't clip their nose hair, and so I think if you're judging in a different country, make sure you know what their government regulations are.
Absolutely, I had that highlighted, so you're ahead of me, of
I
course.
am?
Yeah, you're already Johnny on the spot,
No
or
pun-
Patty on the spot.
no
How
pun
about that?
intended.
Yeah, you're a little Patty on the spot there, huh? Provide some comic
Do I have a
relief.
question?
Oh,
We have a question about when the horse is being backed. I don't know if you want to take that now. Okay.
You bet.
And just that fine line between being backed readily and too much where it's rushed and tense.
Great question.
Yeah.
And we talk about, we'll discuss that in a maneuver evaluation, but I think we can discuss it again. And
Yeah.
I think that there's a couple things to that. A pattern needs to have the same rhythm and cadence from the start to the beginning. And I think that comes from knowing your horse, and part of being a showman and showing your horse. If you have a lazy horse, you don't want to go faster in one pattern than the other. You need to know your horse. If you've got a nice light horse, you're going to be able to do all that pattern and crisply and efficiently.
right.
So, in obviously a higher degree of difficulty is if you can, we'll talk about this in the hierarchy of judging, but you've got to be able to perform that maneuver and not overdo it. So if you take a backup and make it go too fast, and you'll be able to see a horse struggling, they need to be able to back promptly, give through the pole, step their feet back in rhythm and cadence. A backup is a 2-beat gait, and be able to step back, and if an exhibitor pushes their horse past that, either something's going to happen, they're going to go crooked, something is going to happen, or that's just going to look rushed, and you can address that in your maneuver evaluation.
Well said.
Yeah. Anything to add to that?
Not really.
Okay.
I think that it just needs to be consistent with the rest of the pattern, and if all of a sudden this backup looks frantic, and overly rushed and such, then that's not what it is we're after. Just because it was fast does not mean that it was still correct.
Exactly.
Good question.
Good.
And again, this might vary a little bit from location to location, but that there's some variance on how a horse's hooves and feet can be prepared.
Right. Exactly.
If they come clunkety and that's probably not a good sign.
Right. Exactly.
Same here. You don't have to have the fanciest show halter, but it needs to be neat, clean, professional, good repair, and it needs to fit that horse's head properly.
It needs to be a consideration in your score, for sure.
If it's hanging off their head, that's not a good thing.
Exactly.
I'll comment on this next part because I'm not in any way trying to take liberty with the rules. It's just the way that I've mentally organized. And I think that that's probably my key point here with every judge, is that you have to come to some means of organization of your thought process and how you go about evaluating. And as an NRHA judge, I've kind of had this pounded in my head, and so a lot of times I've found that I draw from other classes and will apply those concepts. And so, their philosophy is, in terms of evaluating the pattern performance, is that you first determine if a horse is on pattern, which means in their case that it's avoided disqualification, which would be the same in ours, and we'll talk about what those disqualifications are, so that then they're eligible, for placing. And then correct is where, in our case, it's going to be a performance that is going to result in a check, or what we're thinking about is average or correct, something to that effect. And there's a lot of ways that you can get to that. And then lastly, here's this degree of difficulty, and that's going to vary depending upon the pattern, the maneuvers within that pattern, and really what that horse and exhibitor's capabilities are. So if we take those three things and we go through them, I always, again, I kind of draw from other classes here, this whole mindset of strategic observation and things that you can start looking for in patterns that you would have already kind of prepared yourself mentally for. These things could potentially happen, so that it minimizes the surprise. I think oftentimes what we as judges can have happen is you're like, whoop, didn't see that one coming.
That's right.
And so you're scrambling with, how do you consider that? And unfortunately, we'll get distracted by that particular part because maybe we weren't quite ready for that and we're trying to process that, and yet the pattern has gone on, the exhibitor and the horse have moved on, and you still need to be judging it, and you're behind, you're lagging behind them, and and it takes you a while to catch up. So I think the more we can prepare ourselves mentally for things that could potentially happen, then we're going to do a better job of staying with that horse and exhibitor.
Very good.
So that's really where I come from on all that. So again, things that avoid disqualification. Some of these are pertinent to other classes, although maybe a little bit of a unique one is relative to using artificial aids that
Right.
Sometimes we see that are in halter exhibition
Right.
that we don't see. It's not allowable here in this class.
Right. Exactly.
So there might be dirt in a person's hand or something like that. That's
Right.
still not things that we want to see them do.
Exactly.
Then when you get specifically here to this pattern, knocking over or the wrong side of cones, we don't have that many cones and markers in a lot of our patterns
That's
today,
right.
so it's maybe not quite as big of an issue, but sometimes you'll still see some pattern designs where it's pretty easy for an exhibitor to get on the wrong side, or maybe even a lot of times I try to be real mindful of this when I'm setting the pattern. That first starting cone, I try to set it up relative to where the gate position is, that as exhibitors come in or they're preparing themselves, even if there's a makeup area and there's a general couple of cones that kind of configures what would be a gate, that I try to set that cone where I'm not trying to trap them.
Right.
I
That's key.
want them to be mindful of the position they should be, but I try to go ahead and set it up where hopefully the whole pattern can flow properly, but that I position it where I'm not trying to set them up to see, well, are they smart enough to know which side of the cone they should be? So I try to avoid traps if at all possible on that.
I think that that's key, and when you're setting your pattern, make sure that the flow is another important thing, and that somebody with a big horse can do it as successfully as somebody with a small horse.
Right.
That you're considerate of that when you're not, when you're setting those, if you have multiple cones.
The only other thing that I would just share with the group that sometimes I always try to make sure that I am aware of, especially if you get into larger classes, is that you literally are walking through every step with the exhibitor. And so for not performing a specific gait or sometimes turn, sometimes exhibitors are so slick in how they can move from one part into another in that they have forgotten to include something, but they don't really give you any sign that they did it, that if you're not paying attention,
Absolutely.
and if you're not conscious of that and literally mentally walking through it, you can go, did they? And you can
Yes.
ask yourself that question. So we just want to make sure that you're engaged.
Yeah, and you've got to make sure that you're ready for that next horse. And if they're pushing the horses through too fast, we're going to we encourage our judges to make comments on their score sheets. With that being said, don't write a book and hold the whole show up. There's, people love comments, and it helps take the industry, alleviate, gets away from trends or negative things, or it promotes, good qualities or characteristics that you see in a pattern. But, if they're sending those horses in too fast, you are within your right. You have control of that arena to be able to just, ask them to send them in just a little bit slower, because if it's equitation and the first maneuver is a right diagonal, you better be ready to see them trot off in case they miss their diagonal and you miss a major penalty. So, or if, in a showmanship pattern, it's a walk, and it's a short walk or whatever, you need to make sure that you're not looking up and seeing them trot and go, oh my gosh, did they walk?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
It's a terrible feeling.
Oh.
So you got to stay focused and, make sure that if you might have a less experienced ring steward, or you might be doing your own card on your own, and they've got to be able to give you a chance to transfer that number to your ladder sheet.
And if I'm judging with another judge, it's my responsibility, and I'm not going to go, hey, Patty, did they?
Yeah.
If anything, if I have any question, I would go through my ring steward. If I'm not confident, if I'm by myself, I'm going to go with giving the exhibitor the benefit of the doubt, unless there happens to be an official videographer.
Right.
I'm not going to use some mom's video that she goes, here, look at this, right?
Exactly. That's not appropriate. And I think the appropriate, there is that rule in our judges guidebook, in the judges section, that you can confer on major penalties with the presence of a ring steward. You're not compelled to call that penalty. needs to be done efficiently, and it cannot happen when that person is in their run. That run has to be complete. And probably the best, most appropriate place to do it in any class is either if it's a big class, they're gonna have a drag, or if it's at the end of the class. I mean, you don't want to, you've just gotta be so aware of public perception, and so you that is in there so you can be on the same page with major penalties. Have to have a ring steward, make your decision, do it at an appropriate time. It is not appropriate to speak to your other judges while a horse is on course. It is not appropriate. And that brings us to another key, something that we're going to talk about all when judging your position. Make sure that you're not close to the judge, that your fellow judges. Spread out. It's public perception. You know, it's your integrity as a judge. You want to know that you're judging your card, and somebody's not outside going, well, you know, they're judging together, it's a consensus, and they're talking back and forth. That's a terrible reputation to have. You want to know that you're judging your own card and that you have integrity.
Absolutely. And just realizing that some positions during a course of a pattern are going to give a little better view or perspective on certain maneuvers than others. And so there may be a case where you might have a better view of one part and I might have a better view of another. And so our placings may be slightly different as a result of maybe what each of us saw. So that happens to be a case, I think, in this particular class that can definitely creep into. The only other little comment I would make on this is that in our case, my wife and I judge quite a bit together, and she tends to design a lot of the patterns such that if there's multiple levels of a pattern, so let's say we have a level 1 pattern, and then maybe if we have a youth class, maybe we have a little bit different level for a 13 and under, and then maybe a 14 through 18 or such, is that we'll maybe increase the level of difficulty, but I need to always make sure that between classes, I make sure that I've changed myself mentally, because we always try to keep the same cone design if at all possible, even if we've changed up adding maneuver or taking out a maneuver or such. And I need to make sure that I, the judge, am mentally engaged, that I'm looking at the right pattern on the first horse.
Very good.
Okay.
Something to note here with our level 1 and rookie classes is that exhibitors going off pattern. Now this is you know, a challenge as a level 1 judges. Every class is slightly different when it comes to what is a disqualification, what goes to the bottom of the class. We're going to look at that on the judges committee and see if we can't make that a little more uniform, and if not, we'll put together a nice little chart for you so you have a reference point, because every class is different. So I would highly recommend, before you judge any of the classes, that you look at what the disqualifications are for the level 1 classes and the rookie, because in the showmanship, horsemanship, and equitation, exhibitors going off pattern, knocking over a cone or on the wrong side of the cone, never performing a specified gait, or overturning more than a quarter turn than designated, they will not be disqualified, but must always place below the exhibitors not incurring a disqualifying fault. And how do you denote that on your scorecard, John?
Well, I do make sure that I have clearly noted that, and I've seen various things. Some people will either circle a particular maneuver, making sure that they're not necessarily indicating that it's a penalty score 0, but that they have identified the maneuver where that particular infraction occurred, and make sure that their final score reflects that as well, or that they've noted by their final score with either a star or they've circled that score or something to make sure that they do place them below, even though maybe mathematically, numerically, it may not be the lowest score.
And Karen, maybe if anybody wants us to go over what we call a ladder sheet, if they don't understand what a ladder sheet is, let Karen know, and we've got a big one that we can show you how to use a ladder sheet effectively.
On that one,
yeah, there you go.
itself.
Yeah, we can work that. We'll do that when we do the.
Okay, in terms of just, what's correct, again, it's really what gets this particular component of the pattern to a check, what we're going to call basically average or 0, if you're thinking about it from a numerical number. And there's a variety of ways to get to that. It can be that there's a little bit of positive and a little bit of negative, and so overall it ends up being about average or a check. Or it may be that every part of it you're just going, well, that's pretty accurate, it's fairly precise, it's fairly smooth, and it's fast enough, but at the same time, just maybe doesn't have the degree of difficulty to add a plus to that. So whether it's a check plus or a plus, but that you've deemed that is going to be correct.
Right.
And then as we either raise it by adding degree difficulty, or we'll lower it by having some incorrectness into that, then that's when hopefully our assessment mark is a check minus or a minus or a double minus, so hopefully would reflect that.
Well, and I think that is correct. In that term, correct, average, what is correct is so important all the way across in every class, because if you can determine what correct is, it's going to help you go up or go down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we'll say this in just a little bit, but I'll go ahead and say it again now, is that what I think is really most important is that each and every judge have that already in mind before the very first exhibitor, very first maneuver ever occurs. And a lot of times that may be that you need to refresh your eye by having watched some video or having watched some runs, because they're so available now, especially with Blackboard, just to kind of get yourself in a particular range. It doesn't mean that your scores have to be exactly like ours or whoever else it is you're judging with, but that make sure that you're consistent and you know what your standard is right off the bat.
And I'll add something to that. Jeremy Olson does all of our videoing at the World Shows, and Mike Garner's out there, and you can buy, video runs to practice and download the score sheets from the World Show of the judges, but it's always going to look different on video than it does on those actual score sheets when you're practicing. So it might gives you guidelines, but you're not. It always looks different than it does on the DVD or wherever you get your runs on the jump drive.
Well, just to kind of zip through these rest parts so we can get back to the judging, just a few key things I would say on this is that we want to make sure that it's the horse that's being led to the judge, and that it's amazing to me, really, how few exhibitors sometimes can just be straight. As simple as that word might imply, that it's not always easy just to lead a horse straight with the horse going directly to the judge.
Well, and I think that is another thing that was a lost art in with the setups is, they got to set up and you got to be able to lead them straight. So.
And then in this next line, that the horse keeps themselves straight. Right. Because a lot of times a horse, just because of habit and having practiced a certain way, will have their head cocked off, and that they won't be in line with their spine and back and the rest of their body.
And I think all through all the maneuver evaluations, you've got to pay attention to how correct that horse is and how straight their spine is, whether they're backing, turning, setting up,
So maybe going back to one of Karen's questions earlier, I'd ask you this. Where do you take your eye as you're watching the exhibitor go through the various maneuvers to get a feel for both where the exhibitor is in their position as well as what the horse is doing?
Okay, so I'm going to use the term that I always use called soft eyes.
Right.
That's my term. But I think that, if you use soft eyes and then you have your eye dropped, which I've also learned through NRHA schooling, is that, in your turns, you're going to be maybe a little more focused on where that pivot foot is, but you still have to be able to assess what the exhibitor is doing and the whole correctness of the horse and how they're performing that maneuver.
Totally agree. And however it is a person needs to phrase that for themselves, they need to develop the ability to maybe see a little bit of a detail and yet still keep the overall big picture in mind as well, and not lose sight of other things that might be happening with a little bit of a peripheral.
Exactly. And there's some really good things in it to talk about here in the stop. The stop has to be straight. And what I really like to see, for me, that's credit earning, is when a horse stops and they stop square, they stop with collection. That to me tells me that as a coach and as a judge, that next maneuver is probably going to be really good, because that horse stops balanced and they stop square and underneath themselves. And you have a horse with good conformation, they're going to do that. It's easy for them.
It's easier.
You don't have to work so hard.
That's right.
But and then again, the backup is straight, prompt, smooth, responsive. So it's goes back to what we talked about earlier.
Karen, have a question? Oh, no.
We
okay.
good.
No,
Okay.
we're good.
All right.
Yep. Turns. Oh my goodness, there's so much focus on turns, and it's definitely important. And we've got a lot of faults that specifically come into play here relative to turns. And I think that, again, we've already commented on this a little bit, is that sometimes the focus can get so great on just trying to focus on that inside pivot foot that we lose sight of all the other things that are going on there. Because you need to be mindful of where this exhibitor's position is relative to the horse, how responsive and agreeable the horse is with making that turn, that they're keeping their body in balance as well as pretty straight as they go across, and that it's smooth and it's in rhythm and cadence that would be consistent with the rest of the run, and that you're not asking yourself, well, gosh, where did that come from? That all of a sudden they just run around and it looks frantic or overly hurried.
Right. Good. I think we've talked about setting up a lot.
Yeah.
I think they got the memo on the setup.
Well, I hope so. I still think that our exhibitors need to continually practice and get mindful of the fact that hopefully we as judges are going to truly evaluate it, and we're going to take into some account of how promptly they do it versus how square it is. And if they just make a move or two, and I realize it's kind of like playing poker, you got to decide how good a hand you got, is that if they leave them really poorly set, that even if they might have done it in one move, that they probably should maybe take the time to get a little squarer. And I know that those are difficult calls to make, and there's not an exact formula that we can give them as to how long and how square. But if you have to count too high, very many numbers, then that's probably too high.
Well, I think the exhibitor has to exhibit that they've practiced with their horse and they have a system to set their horse up. And this talks about the exhibitor does not have to reset a horse that stops square. And I think the whole what happens to that, do they just get lucky and they stop square, or do they stop square because that horse has been balanced and they've stopped them balanced and straight? And so I think that if they have done that, then that's, really that's a horse that is trying to help the exhibitor out, and that is credit earning. If they stop and it's sheer luck, then it's probably correct.
All right, very good.
So.
Yes. All right, so this next component again that talks about in the rule book about degree of difficulty, you can again use what mindset you want, but just be sure that correctness and precision is not sacrificed. So there's a variety of considerations. It's not just speed. So if are they doing it with more finesse? Is it maybe even appear to be smoother? Yes, quickness and some speed might get into that, but that you don't want to sacrifice the other important components.
Exactly.
And that's going to vary a little bit by pattern as to what those specific maneuvers are. And that may be one of those discussions that you have with the other judges about, gosh, I think these are places where an exhibitor really has a chance to maybe earn. And it may be in the setup as much as anything. But this is going to take your maneuver score assessment from a check to a check plus, or a plus, and maybe even a double plus.
Right, very good. Or the other way, if they overdo it.
Yes, for sure.
There's that
Absolutely.
risk taking.
Okay, I think we probably have addressed most of this fairly well. Again, with the final score, hopefully of a 70, going to reflect the overall performance of an average performance. Now, there's a lot of different ways to get there, and we'll see that as these group descriptions come in play, that if you're talking about a very good to an excellent performance, but yet there's a fault that occurs somewhere along the way, that maybe the final score does end up close to a 70, and I think we've got a couple of good examples to show that.
Absolutely.
Then the other part of this, of the scoring system and the methodology here is that we don't want to be overly discouraging to our exhibitors.
Absolutely.
And so while we want to reflect appropriately what their score is, that if you can avoid going below a 50, then I think we certainly want to try to avoid going below a 50. Even if you have multiple faults,
I agree.
they can look on there and they can see where their faults are.
They know that they had problems. There's no point giving them a 35 or a 25.
I see no reason that we need to insult our exhibitors.
Exactly.
They can figure that out, unless it's a disqualification. And
Right.
That is what it is.
Right. Exactly. I agree.
All
Well,
right.
we're going to talk about the OF and P as we go through our the ranges that we use, and that's a key part of your scoring system. Is when an exhibitor comes and they look at that score sheet to see how they did. That OF and P range is going to tell them their range of if they are an excellent showman.
Is our score sheet on this? Maybe one more. So let's try one more and see if it is.
There
we
it is.
go.
There it is.
Yeah, so on the bottom there, it gives those various descriptions of OF and P. And I think there's been a lot of discussion amongst the judges, so we'll just be candid about it,
Yes.
that F, if I'm a teacher and I give you an F, that there's usually a negative context that goes along with that that is not positive, and that they feel like they failed. There are going to be some situations where exhibitors are going to be below good, and until we change the score sheet in any manner, that F is there. But I would encourage people that they are going to use the F, that they write the word out.
Yes.
And that they write the word fair, not fail. There's a key letter difference in that.
That's right. They're fair. They're not failing.
Right.
Right.
And so I hopefully that describes that. And then try again to find and to utilize that entire range of good, very good, and excellent. And that realize that a horse's performance and the pattern performance can still incur faults, and yet overall, maybe this exhibitor did have an excellent or a very good or certainly a good performance that lowers their score because of the fault, but that doesn't mean that they had an overall really poor performance or fair performance.
And I think that that's really worth reiterating. So if you have an exhibitor that is a VG in the 80s and they incur a penalty, their horse spooks or whatever, they can still remain in that VG category, even though their score might be below the 80s.
Right.
And that's well within your range. You're reflecting that they are a very good exhibitor, but they had an issue that day.
I think we can finish up probably the rest of these deductions pretty quickly here.
Sure.
Is that my biggest comment here is that you need to know what the point value is of those minor, major, and severe faults are, and you also need to recognize what those are, and that you're not having to look them up in your rule book or having to look at the score sheet too much. So again, it goes back to we as judges need to make sure that we're familiar with our scoring systems and we know what those are, and that we need to be ready on that very first horse. Keys here, there's some really important words on here. You want to make sure that we try to consider both the exhibitor and their performance of their pattern and overall presentation, as well as the pattern itself, and that we need to be consistent within a class and across classes, and that we need to make sure that from exhibitor to exhibitor we try to be as consistent as we can, whether it's the first exhibitor or the final exhibitor on whatever number that class is. And I know that sometimes that's challenging in bigger classes, but we want to recognize the positive, be as positive as we can, and then appropriately deduct. As we go through the various fault sections, again, if there's any questions, then maybe they can fire those to Karen, but I think that most of those are pretty clear for the most part. One of the questions, or one of the things that I think that you and I both recommend, Patty, is that on 2 strides, we tend to
How many steps is that, John?
Yeah, we tend to equate that to steps, and I do it with the hind feet, and so I count 4 steps of the hind feet, and as long as it's 4 steps or fewer, then I'll leave that as a minor fault once it exceeds 4 steps. So if I get to the number 5, then I'm going to go on to a major.
Right, very good. Oh, whoops, wait a minute, that's my cue, sorry.
That okay?
Over and under turning is straightforward.
Yep.
Hitting or ticking a cone.
Sliding
a pivot foot, here we go.
Yeah, I think this is one that we as judges sometimes can get confused with a major as well. Is that, and you're going to have to determine at times whether it's a slide or whether they've clearly stepped out of a pivot. And as we look at some of the verbiage here in this next item of lifting a pivot foot during a pivot, and that little part of parentheses and italics there is really us to try to provide a little bit of clarification. That's not literally in the rule book right now. That the whole point of that is it's lifting a foot and basically putting it back in the same place.
Once presented.
Once presented.
You're right. And we see
Once
that
presented.
those 2 penalty applications have been maybe used a little inconsistently in the field, so we want to make sure that that's perfectly clear when they're, if they slide a pivot foot, it's a minor. So what would you define sliding as opposed to, we talked about that last night, sliding as opposed to significantly moving it?
Well, again, I think that's going to be a judgment call.
Right.
And it might vary a little bit per judge, but my view is that once a horse has literally picked their foot up and they have clearly moved it out of the track, then I'm going to say that's stepping out of.
Right.
If they have their foot
Which would be a major.
Which would be a major.
Correct.
As opposed to if they keep their foot on the ground and they slide it a reasonable amount, and I'm not going to give a specific distance. I don't know what 6 inches in centimeters or anything is anyway.
I should know that.
Yeah, there we go with all our international folks. Yeah, you're our international rep
I know.
on that. But if it feels significant enough that you go, because remember, a major fault is a large deduction.
Absolutely.
And so, I think that sometimes we as judges have been a little trigger happy on calling what's described here as a minor as an actual major.
Right. Good. And then the setup, once they've presented, if a horse picks a foot up and puts it down in the exact same place, that would be a minor.
Right.
As opposed to what we'll talk about here.
Perhaps some might have seen that in one of those earlier runs.
Perhaps they might have. We'll see if they caught
yeah,
that.
Right.
Okay, moving on to our major faults.
Okay, count more than 4.
Right. Steps.
Yes, steps.
Right.
Hind legs. Steps,
Yes.
hind legs. There we go. 10 feet, I know sometimes can be a little bit of a challenge because, again, we've moved away from having cones in a lot of our patterns. And so in my mind, I think that there's a couple of key considerations here for us as judges. Is, again, we want to give our exhibitor a benefit of the doubt. So the 2 things that I keep in mind are, one is if you're certain that they are way out of the range area of where they should have performed whatever the transition is, then I think that's a consideration. And then secondly is just watching the exhibitor and determining if they're asking their horse to do something, whether it's to speed up or to slow down, and they're not responding. And if you go more than, most of our stock horses tend to be about 8 feet in length. So if you go more than a horse's length, clearly, in either of those considerations there, then I think that's when you get into a major. But again, remember, a major is a big deduction.
And what did you say about, I don't think you don't want to be looking for a major fault, but you need to be focused enough to when it comes
be aware.
I thought you said that really well earlier.
Good.
Good.
I'm going to try to re-say it then.
I know. That's really good. I need to write that down as a Johnism.
Yeah. Splitting the cone, I don't think we see that quite as much anymore because there tend to not be as many cones placed out. But if it does happen, then it happens. All right. We're almost finished up here.
And again, that's the horse that moves the hind end significantly during a pivot or turn.
So stepping out of the setup or then sliding and stepping out versus sliding in a turn. I'll spit that out in a sec. Yeah.
Got it.
There you go.
I think those are all self-explanatory.
Okay.
Okay, this is a new one in the rule book this year. Believe it or not, it has not been in there. I think it's always been meant to be in there.
Right.
And that's why we have it underlined. Resting a foot or hip shot in a setup. Now, it's in the online version of our rule book. Any changes that have been updated, probably if always go to the online version of our rule book. That is our default version. In the printed rule book, it did not make resting a foot or hip shot in a setup. Did not make it into the printed rule book, but it is it was approved to be put in the rule book. So
it might not have made it in because hip shot, the printer might not have thought that was a real word. If you're not from Texas, you might not know what that means. So
That's right.
some of our internationals, that's their cocked. They have their hip cocked. How's that?
That's right. Okay, severe faults. We'll go over those. They're, exhibitor is not in the required position during inspection. Again, John spoke on that.
Not using the quarter method.
Totally not using the quarter method. A 20-point deduction is huge. So they stand there and the judge moves around them and they don't even attempt. There's your 20 point.
There you go.
This is obviously, these are, safety things, kicking a horse or pointing their feet at a horse for setup, standing directly in front of the horse. Again, 20-point deduction. If you're gonna lay at that 20-point deduction on and make sure it's there.
And I'm right here that's where if you're sure when they're backing that they're clearly standing in front, that's really the rule that we would go to on that. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, good.
That's correct. And you can always take it out of a maneuver deduction if you're not sure.
Right.
If it's making you think about it, it's probably not a correct maneuver.
That's right.
So there's more than one way to address something if you're not quite sure. Right. Loss of lead shank. You'll see this as they change sides. They'll drop that lead shank. Again, they can slide it down, no problem, but they can't let go.
Right.
Severe disobedience. So I think these are all very straightforward. We want to get back to
judging those runs so that we can let people go eat before they start getting hangry at us.
Exactly. It must be dinner somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere.
Not lunch.
Yeah.
But just on the final scoring, we'll address this as in our OF and P columns. So excellent would be 90 to 100. Very good is 80 to 89. 70 to 79 is good. 60 to 69 is fair. Less than 59 is poor, and like we said, you know, no need to go any lower than 50, even with severe faults. And again, going back to this, if you are going to denote a run by being fair, make sure you write it out. Okay? Do you have questions?
Yeah, it looks like the question on the left pivot foot versus the right pivot foot being recorded, they're saying thank you, so it looks like you guys have already addressed that one.
Great.
So good work.
Okay.
And then I guess we're needing some clarification on splitting the cone.
Well, splitting the cone, as I understand the description, is if there's a cone placed in the pattern so that literally if an exhibitor is moving around their horse, that they would get the cone between them and the horse. And so that they've set too close to a cone, correct me if I'm wrong, and that in the course of moving around that horse, somehow they've stepped on the opposite side, or sometimes they literally step across it, that is what splitting the cone means.
Or they might do a turn and end up too close to that turn and end up, their horse is on one side and they're on the other.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right,
Good
catches
question.
us back up. Thank you.
Is
You're
that
welcome.
good? Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go back and do our runs. I'm going to be John's scribe, and we are going to go through and
Quickly judge these and then let people take a quick eating bite. Right?
yes. So,
We good? What do you
oh,
think?
I was looking at my marker, but I
Okay,
got it.
she
I
found
found
it.
it. Okay,
Great.
here we go.
Patty is a fantastic scribe, by the way. Plus, you can read her handwriting.
Maybe.
Gosh, you know, just your first impression is very positive. You know, this horse and exhibitor both look really ready to go, and she certainly meets the attire requirement. She steps off, and that horse is right there beside her. So you're feeling very positive about this. You know, you're going. It's beyond correct. You certainly with the promptness and effectiveness, that horse has moved up with them. You know, I think you want to call that good, very good to excellent. And the stop was all really good as well. So I would have gone check plus on the walk and the trot both. And then that back was good to very good. This turn, the horse is very straight and correct. It's very prompt. You know, I think that you could go plus on that altogether. The trot is very good and then the walk, maybe that transition to the walk could be a little more prompt. It's probably still correct. And maybe the walk could have been just a little straighter. The horse you see is just slightly off on that. So the trot itself, I would have called that good to very good. So I'm thinking check plus to plus. On the walk itself, I would probably check that. And then this set, really prompt, very accurate. She does a really good job on the inspection part as well. So from what we can see there, I would have said check plus to plus on both of those compartments. And then on the turn and go off, I still think that was at least correct. And if you want to call that good, then you could call that a check to check plus. Woof.
There you go. Good job.
You know, so that's a lot to try to articulate there. And at the minimum, I think you would want to call this overall form and presentation a very good. And I think if you want to call it an excellent, that's fine. So I would have had this young lady in the low 90s, low to mid 90s.
92.
92 sounds like a great number to me.
Okay.
You know, and I don't think that you necessarily have to come up mathematically with a certain number. I know that certain judges have a numerical starting point that they want to have. So maybe if you call it an excellent and you're going 90, and then you add a number, you know, that's associated with each of those check pluses or pluses. However you come up with that final score, there's a variety of different strategies on how to do that. I think you want to make sure you have your system planned out
And it's consistent.
and that it's consistent.
Yeah.
That you're not just pulling a number from the air.
Exactly. And the thing is that you know, John, I might have scored her a 94, you scored her a 92, somebody else might score her 89,
Right.
but she's still the first place horse.
Exactly.
That you've got your horses grouped together. You've got the best ones at the top. And you know, we talk about using our range. You've got 100 points. You know, we're giving you 50 points because we want the bottom to be, you know, bottom is 50. So we're giving you 50 points to play with. You have got to use your numbers. And if she's the first horse that comes in and you score her 70, it's going to be miserable for you judging that whole entire class because you're going to be struggling with that. So, you know, be prepared for that first horse. Oftentimes that first horse is going to be your winner, sometimes not.
And you have to go back to one of your pillars of
That's
having
right.
the courage
That's
to
right.
recognize excellence there and to reward it.
And if one comes in and is better, what do? You score them higher.
Exactly. Exactly. You've got your range.
Yeah, we've got plenty of range there. And if somebody wanted to score that one in the mid-90s, there's nothing wrong with that in my mind.
Nope. Absolutely. Any comments, questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Several.
Okay.
Darn.
One, probably a clarification on the definition of hip shot.
Yep.
They're asking if you would call it at the beginning of the pattern, so I want to make sure we're all talking about the same thing.
Okay, so a horse that is resting a foot, whenever they did that, that's when that penalty would occur.
So
If the exhibitor's standing there looking at you ready to go, but the horse is resting a foot,
once you start judging,
okay.
at that point, which would include if that exhibitor is standing there at the cone ready to go, and you've just begun judging and they're standing there hip shot with their hip cocked, then I would consider that in that score. Patty, do you agree?
Yes, I do. I'm good.
Okay, great. And then the split issue, and I have to apologize, this may have been addressed, but it's an interesting question, and I want to make sure we cover it. If the exhibitor comes too close to you, the judge, and ends up moving, and it's around your marker on the ground, would you call that splitting?
I would not say that that's splitting an official cone or an official marker. If they're that close to me, I'm going to have taken that into the maneuver consideration, because there's times that I can smell some exhibitors that I really don't want to. I'm too close to them. That tells me they're probably just a little bit too close.
And those are the horses that usually blow snot over you.
Yeah. If you feel as a judge that you're having to move back like that, I factor that into my maneuver score.
Okay, and then speaking of maneuver scores, as we're trying to stay positive and keep the score at 50 or above, when there's several exhibitors that have multiple severe faults, would that be a time you might need to manipulate that a little more to get your placings?
Well, Patty and I talked about that, and I think there's a couple different ways. If you really feel like you want to, it's important to you to have a number that would clearly designate that, then certainly you have the ability to do that. There's 100 points here, and you can do that. I think that you also, if you look at two different exhibitors, and you look at their score line, and if you look across there and one has more severe or major faults than the other, then you can use that as a tiebreaker, and I think probably exhibitors would be able to figure that out on their own.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep,
All
we
right.
want to be scoring on the positive. We want our people to come back and keep trying to improve themselves, not car kill them and think they don't have a chance.
Right.
Okay, good.
Okay. You ready for
Good.
two?
Run two. Good job. Oh, by the way, just stop. Hold it, Tanner. Sorry. One thing that I'm not looking at the screen, and I was able to come up with all your checks, check plus minuses based on your verbiage.
Wow.
I was listening and recorded it. Okay.
And I might add this part of it is that if I'm judging, I am not saying all these things.
That's right.
I would just say check minus, whatever. If there's a major fault, I would not be giving a dissertation here about this
right.
run.
That's
and
right.
for certain, without any audible pickup by a mic or an exhibitor or anything like that. And I think that as a judge, you want to be cautious about your comments to your ring steward.
Very good.
And you don't want to say things that would be misinterpreted in any way. So I'm just trying to say more than I normally would here as a judge, which would just be the maneuver call. That's all I would call is that and faults. So I'm glad that thought came up, is that make sure that this is not my normal MO.
Yeah.
And I certainly wouldn't
Tanner,
recommend
we'll
that.
take it from the top if you don't mind, so we can get a fair.
Now, it's interesting on this one that you happen to be picking her up as she walks up to the cone, and you probably very likely would not have actually been watching her at this point. So as a judge, you probably have just finished up your previous score, and you look up there and you see her and she's ready to go, but lo and behold, guess what? She's sitting there hip shot. Great example right there. And so we're going to apply a major fault on that, and that starts off that maneuver as really in the minus mindset. And this horse is certainly not moving up there with the promptness, and this rider's literally just kind of having to tug along the way. So it's certainly not correct, and I think that you could minus, even potentially double minus, but there's no reason to be too ugly there. The same with the trot. I think at best you would go that's poor, and so you would want to go check minus. And then on this particular turn, we'll say on the back that was probably poor as well. And then on that turn, there was a slide of the foot. I don't know, Tanner, if you can back up just enough to catch. I don't know where we're at on that. And there you go. You're awesome. If we can just maybe pick it up there when she starts the turn just a little bit further, you'll see that she actually, at the minimum, slide. And if you think that she clearly picks that foot up, and I think that you're going to see that called both ways. That particular day, I think that we thought there was enough evidence that she did pick that up, and we called that a major. But at minimum, you're going to call that a minor, and that's a poor turn as well. Again, the horse could be just a little more prompt up beside the exhibitor there. You could maybe check, call that correct, but I would probably call that poor. The walk is okay up until the stop, and then she's a little crooked there, so I would have called that a check or a check minus. Then here for the setup, the exhibitor's not very straight, and that's certainly a poor, even from this angle, to maybe very poor type of a setup. She should have spent a little more time, hopefully, trying to get this horse a little squarer. So I would have definitely called that probably a very poor for a full minus on that. And then we turn to go, and that's probably all just on the correct side. And as she kind of tugs off there, you could even think that that's on the poor side. So overall, as an overall F&P, I think on the downside you would potentially put F for fair. Perhaps if you're feeling like she is going to be representative of good that day, you could put that. But I'm going to say she's probably going to be in the fair range. And then you can look across there and you can establish a score that even if you say that she's in the mid-60s, that when you add on at least one major and potentially, for a major and a minor at the minimum and potentially two majors, you're going to be right there at that 50 threshold. And so you're going to probably have her in the 50 to lower 50s kind of a range.
What would you put as a comment to, how would you, something that's really interesting to me is I went to the Western Dressage Championship show, their World Championship show, and they're huge on comments. If it's a score of 6 or less, it's mandatory as a Western Dressage judge to make a comment. They've not, and their scribes just write comments. They don't add any scores up. So, I think that we don't want to go to that extreme.
Time,
but because of time, but you want to be encouraging, even though she got a 52, or 50. What would you put to? I would want her to know that the horse was hip shot.
Right. If you think there's any question as to what those majors would be, I tried to put some kind of an abbreviation or indication of what those would be. And again, depending upon if you're doing the writing and how much time you have right there and how good your penmanship is, because mine's terrible compared to yours. So I could write down something really elaborate there and they wouldn't be able to read it. But I think what I always try to do is I try to indicate what those majors were.
Right, good. Gives them a little feedback.
Yeah, and if there's some other major deduction, again, I think you want to be cautious that you don't want to be overly negative or put down a comment that would be misinterpreted too negatively.
I think her, is well fit.
Yes. And if you can put down something positive and encouraging, you want to do that. She's made out well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Put something positive
Turned
there
out
too.
well. Yep.
So in using the ladder sheet, do we have anybody that wants us to use the ladder sheet? Okay, good. So you guys know how to use the ladder sheet.
But if they wanted to, they could over here.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, and then our third one. So the horse starts off here pretty good, and then it is clear this horse is jogging, but the exhibitor doesn't appear to have any mindfulness of that, and had certainly not moved up themselves. So if you go back and if you counted those steps, you would find that it was more than two strides or 4 steps from behind, and so that would have been a major, and you would at least want to call that poor to potentially very poor, so I would have gone a full minus. Then the rest of that maneuver at the trot is at least correct and probably even on the good side that you could go check or check plus. The stop and back I would have said was on the correct to the poor side, so probably check minus. The turn itself was really correct and even on the good side, so if you want to go good there, or check plus, and then that trot and walk both were at least correct, and I think if you want to reward those with a good or a check plus, you could on both of those. Then you might, if you can back that up just a little bit, Tanner, so that they see the setup, because this is one of those cases that if you're not aware, you're going to miss this, that when she stops and sets up, after she gets her horse set and she's presented, this horse definitely moves a foot. Now, where we're at, we don't know exactly whether this horse really picked it up and put it back in the same place, which would be a minor. You see that right there. And it's kind of hard to see through the tail, but you can see it. Or if it was a major. But it was at least one of those two. Plus, you're going to probably take that in the setup itself. And her inspection was certainly acceptable, even maybe on the good side, so I would at least check that. And then her turn and departure off there was at least correct, and if you want to reward that, you could as well. You know, overall, I would think you're thinking about this exhibitor that she's at least good, and you may feel that she's very good. I would have called her good. And then she has what we determined was a major, and you have to be counting steps to have caught that, but you're at least going to have called that a minor, and then you're going to at least have called that move in the set a minor. So she's got at least two minors. We determined that it was one major and one minor. So if you've got her G there, that's going to put her in the 70s. And then if you do whatever math you're going to do, and so let's say that maybe you come up with a number of 74, and then you take off 15 points between the two faults there, so a major and a minor is 15 points, then if you do the math on that, that's going to be a high 60. Somewhere, you know, in the mid to high 60s is, I think, where we ended up, somewhere in that ballpark. And again, your numbers don't have to be exactly what our numbers are. You just need to have some idea of the methodology, how you came up with them, and that you have some good logic for hopefully grouping those horses to where, gosh, we want to make sure that you recognize that first exhibitor was a very good to excellent run and a great standard for you to use with probably any level of exhibitor that that's going to be what you would hope, you know, your high mark would work towards. And then you're going to deal with faults that you need to recognize and consider appropriately in addition to the overall run, which is what takes in play there in the second and the third exhibitor to get to that final score. So you got to do some quick math at times in your head as well.
Yes, we do. I'm waiting to hear which horse it was.
That's the other thing, is when you're writing in comments to Karen, because there's a delay in the feed, be specific on what horse it is so we can identify easier what your question is.
Okay, yes, and there's one that's come in while I'm waiting on the first. On the third horse, the transition into the first trot was not credit earning. Would you consider that in the trot score and lower it? So I guess they're asking, where do you factor in the transition?
I got you. Well, I think what she's saying there is since that horse was already trotting and we incurred that major fault with the walk maneuver, then at the point that you see that exhibitor move up, then that horse did go ahead and increase some speed. But I think what you have to do is you're going to have taken that transition right there that is not going to have been what you asked for, so that's going to have been a poor transition. And then you factor in the rest of that maneuver that they navigate through and be sure that you don't over or under consider that one part of that maneuver, because she had to steer a couple of places there to make that full trot maneuver. I think that's what we're addressing there.
I believe so, and I think right along with that, we've got a question just came in. In that case where you've given the minor penalty, would it be okay to give a check minus rather than a full minus?
Yeah, I think the point on all of these maneuver marks here is that you don't have to be exactly where we are, and you're going to find that from judge to judge. But just like in any kind of a numerically scored class, what you hope that you don't find is that if you look up there where there's check pluses and another judge has minuses all the way across there. Or just the flip side of that, one judge maybe has minuses and check minuses, and another judge has pluses for that same horse on the same maneuver. Someone is not seeing things the same, or considering the same. And so I think that's ultimately what we're hoping for as judges, is that we're getting some consistency of what's correct,
right?
What would raise it above correct to good, very good, or excellent, and then what's poor, very poor, or extremely poor.
Exactly.
Okay, we've got some questions coming in about the movement of the second horse. Could we,
Oh,
As in
when
quality
it turns? When it,
well, as in poor mover, poorly handled, or possibly,
lame?
yes.
Okay, well, if we're talking about movement in terms of quality of movement, as long as the horse can perform the cadence of the required gait, I think that is not really a consideration in this particular class.
And I thought that horse, when it made the turn, it looked kind of questionable, but the horse was so bracy in the halter that I didn't see that consistently. Yeah, I would not have called that horse lame.
Yep.
It made me sure go, I'm going to keep watching it, but I think a lot of it had to do with the resistance through the halter that horse was resisting, and it kind of made it look like it was off a little bit. But again, if you were going to call a horse lame, it needs to be consistently lame.
Yep.
Okay, great. And then, I can't see the score sheet from my seat, but I suspect we've got it looks like we've got a mathematical suggestion. I'm being told that 74 minus 15 equals 59.
Okay. Okay, because
Yes.
we started at 74. Okay, well, thank you.
Now we're caught up.
We still have, our
I thought
placings
we
are
said
still
something
correct.
like that. Yeah.
Our placings are still
Yes,
correct.
yes, yeah. Somehow my mind and mouth didn't connect with my scribe. But that is always good to go back and check your scores too.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's not the scribe's responsibility, it's the judge's responsibility. So I just went, oh
Absolutely.
yeah, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So make sure that all is that was a good test that we're glad that someone caught that. Stars to them.
Exactly.
Kudos to them.
Exactly. Kudos to them.
Good job. Yeah.
John, you are wiser than you realize. Thank you very much.
Is that good?
Yeah, we're
All
caught
right.
up again.